Okay, so we're gonna try this, get through these notes this way. All right, so what's gonna happen here is we are gonna see a rise of things that occur that drive us to the Civil War, all right? So first, we have Kansas and Nebraska, okay? See if I can write this on here. So Kansas, Nebraska. And we said, right, that's going to make all the people flip out because of the idea that slavery could expand anywhere, right? That kind of notion. And so that's going to make people be upset about the sort of idea of slavery moving. Another thing that's going to happen here is Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous work, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is going to be published. Uncle Tom's Cabin is fiction, right? And it was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who once took a trip down to Kentucky where they had slaves, and she took her experiences and turned it into a very moving story, okay? It says right here, she was determined to awaken the North, right, of the wickedness of slavery by laying bare its terrible inhumanity, especially splitting families, right? Relied on powerful imagery and touching pathos. Deeper sources of her anti-slavery sentiments lay in the evangelical crusades of the Second Great Awakening, right? That idea of the Second Great Awakening, to tie this back to like 3 chapters ago, who did the Second Great Awakening empower? Women, right? Women became reformers and all that sort of stuff. So Stowe is one of those people, like Dorothea Dix, and I'm trying to think of another one off the top of my head. And say it again. Okay. So what's going to happen? And here's a little Harriet Beecher Stowe. Here's an image of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to be a huge seller. Okay, that's the thing you need to understand. It's going to be a massive bestseller. Okay, and what it shows us is this idea that media or art is going to have an influence on people and the population. Can anybody think of a piece of media that has influenced like the way people feel about things? It's a very open and broad question or a statement there.
The drawing of the Boston Massacre.
So good job on the drawing of the Boston Massacre. Is that Macintosh? Yeah, well done. Foltz, what were you saying?
Oh, I was saying like posters during the Revolutionary War as well, which is kind of what you were saying.
No, but same notion. Same notion. I like it.
Common sense.
Common sense, good. The Disney propaganda like cartoons. We'll look at those when we get there. Yeah, yeah, those are good. Can anybody think of something maybe that isn't propaganda, that's more, say, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, like something they would read or watch, right? For us, we don't, I mean, I'm not saying people don't sit down and read books anymore, because people do, but I think documentaries are like big on this nowadays.
The Triumph of the Will.
The Triumph of the Will. I haven't seen that one. What is it? Or what is it?
It's like, when you said watch, it's like just rebels' main propaganda.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You're talking World War II again. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fair enough. Okay.
Oh, I was thinking you weren't watching much in the 1800s.
No, no, no. I'm not talking about, I mean, like today, like, for examples I would think of is like, you know, yet again, I'm old, so my examples are not maybe as up to date, but like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was a documentary called Super Size Me. And the guy went around and ate at all the McDonald's and stuff. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, the documentary about SeaWorld, right? And it opened everybody's eyes to how the animals are treated. Yeah, that Coney 2012 video, man, that was such rubbish. Like I remember at the time when that came out, like it alluded, like it did a good job, like showing like, oh, hey man, there's people in Africa like that are really getting a raw deal, like, and I thought that was good. But at the same time, the people that got behind the thing, I think, undermined it, because it was all these kind of sort of like bro types that were trying to like push a lot of that stuff. But what I'll say here, though, right, is with this idea of bestsellers and media influencing people, In the next couple chapters, when we're in the Gilded Age, we're going to talk about a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, yes. Which when I was a student in sophomore American history at Straight Jesuit, we had to read it, right? And it's very not, like, it's a hard read. And in it, right, it exposes like the meatpacking industry. And what happens is the meatpacking industry is bad and does a lot of bad stuff to food. So what comes out of it, right, is going to be the Pure Food and Drug Act. And it shows, like, yet again, how media, books, right, opened up people's eyes, influenced their, opinions, and in turn changed society. In this instance, Harriet Beecher Stowe is upset about, slavery, and so people are going to read this, and people that were kind of on the fence are going to be like, "There's horrible stuff happening to these folks. Slavery is bad." Cal?
That was another good documentary. R. Kelly.
Fair enough. I did not watch the R. Kelly documentary or the Michael Jackson one, but yes. All right. Here's an excerpt right from Uncle Tom's Cabin. The February morning looked gray and drizzling through the window of Uncle Tom's cabin. It looked on downcast faces, the images of mournful hearts. The little table stood out before the fire, covered with an ironing cloth. A coarse but clean shirt or two, fresh from the iron, hung on the back of a chair by the fire. And Aunt Chloe and another spread out before her on the table. Carefully, she rubbed and ironed every fold and every hem with the most scrupulous exactness, every now and then raising her hand to her face to wipe off the tears that were coursing down her cheeks. Tom sat by with his Testament open on his knee, his head leaning upon his hand, but neither spoke. It was yet early, and all the children lay asleep together in their little rude trundle bed. Tom, who had to the full the gentle domestic heart which woe for them has been a peculiar characteristic of his unhappy race, got up and walked silently to look at his children. "It's the last time," he said. So this excerpt, right, is talking about the heartbreak of the children and the family being split up, right, due to slavery. The idea being that slave owners oftentimes encouraged, like, the creation of slave families for a couple of reasons. One, you get more slaves and that's more value, right, more money, right? But also slaves that tended to have families tended to be more, like, compliant on certain levels because they had people in their lives that they cared about. Now, Hadi? Correct. And so in turn, right, but at the same time, they would break up these families and sell the kids off or sell the parents off or whatever and make it a very difficult situation. Success of the novel was big, right? Led to shows called Tom shows, other novels. No other novel in American history can be compared as a political force. When introduced to President Lincoln in 1862, he said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war," right? Yet again, the notion here is that this is one of those things that opens up people's eyes to the problem. Yet again, combine it with Kansas, Nebraska. We're going to combine it with Bleeding Scott and Dred Scott and a financial panic to boot. And I imagine in 1860, it felt like the world was ending. So I'm going to move on from Uncle Tom's Cabin here. Now, what's going to happen, as we mentioned before with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is it led to popular sovereignty in Kansas, meaning that they were going to vote now to decide if they had slavery or not, okay? Much like we've mentioned before, some places they're not, like, kind of designed for slavery. Kansas was one of those places that did not have a lot of slaves. But what's right next to Kansas? Well, Nebraska is next to Kansas, but that's not the one I'm looking for. Who does Kansas have a big rivalry with?
Nebraska.
Missouri?
But no. Missouri, thank you. Missouri. So a lot of people from Missouri flood into Kansas to try to sort of, prop up the pro-slavery group. At the same time, as we'll see here, the New England Immigrant Aid Company basically, sent people to Kansas with weapons, right, with Sharps rifles there, to also prop up the anti-slavery side. And so you can see we have a brewing problem. So it says northern Nebraskans out to abolitionize both Kansas and Nebraska. Some southern hotheads attempted to assist small groups of well-armed slave owners to Kansas. Planting slavery in Kansas was a losing game. Slaves were valuable and volatile properties, it says right there. So the interesting thing is this right down here, right? In the 1860 census, there were 2 slaves among 107,000 people, right? Why would you not take your slaves to Kansas? Don't want them to get shot, right? I want to say it talks about that in the crash course, maybe? Yeah. Same kind of notion though, right? There's a lot of money tied up in it. Was this the class that looked up the value of slaves? It's like, basically, a slave was about $50,000, right? So you're not going to take your slave somewhere that it's going to get shot. That notion. Great question. So the situation gets worse. In 1855, they're going to hold their first election. Border ruffians, right, from Missouri are going to pour in to upset the vote. Slavery supporters triumphed, and they set up a puppet government in Shawnee Mission. Okay, so the Shawnee Mission government is the fraudulent government, or the government that was elected by like a fraudulent election. Okay, the Free Soilers set up their own government in Topeka. Yet again, also, as it says right there, by saying extra legal, that means like outside of the law, okay? So in theory, the Shawnee Mission has the law on their side, but that's because the election was rigged. In this instance, the Free Soilers, the abolitionists, theirs has no legitimacy. So yet again, we have a situation that is not going to be good. So, whoop. Is that, yeah. You can see here in the map, the Kansas Territory up there in the eastern kind of corner there, where all this is kind of going down. Kansas, as it says right there, had their 2 choices, fraud or illegality. The breaking point, right, in 1856, gangs of pro-slavery raiders alleging provocation shot up and burned part of the Free Soil town of Lawrence. Now, don't quote me on this, but I believe this is where we get the rivalry between the University of Kansas and Missouri. So the idea that Missourians went in and burned down Lawrence plays into that today. Now, also, our man John Brown is going to come on the scene here. John Brown was a kind of over-the-top abolitionist, right? And he as it says right there, was obsessively dedicated to the abolitionist cause. What's going to happen is they're going to sneak up on some guys at Pottawatomie Creek there, and he's going to murder 5 dudes with swords. As you'll notice, it says they hacked them to pieces. Terrorist butchery besmirched the Free Soil cause. So the notion here is what? Even though Brown is gung-ho for abolition, how's he hurting the cause?
Killing people?
Murdering people is bad, right? He's too extreme, okay? He's not like correct. Like, he's going to delegitimize their cause by doing extreme things. Here's our picture of Brown. So Civil War breaks out in Kansas in 1856, and this is where we get the concept for bleeding Kansas. Kansas in convulsion. What's going to happen here is we're going to get the Lecompton Constitution. It's going to be basically a pro-slavery constitution. So they could vote for either with slavery or with no slavery, but with protections for slavery already there. So you can get this flavor slavery or that flavor slavery in this constitution. So since there was all this slavery stuff going on with the Constitution, how do you think people went and voted for it? If you were forced with the task of voting for slavery or sort of slavery, but you were like an abolitionist, what would you do? You wouldn't vote, right?
Yeah, you wouldn't vote.
Yeah. So what's going to happen, right, is we're going to see this Lecompton Constitution is going to be passed, but people, the anti-slavery people are yet again going to say that it's fraudulent. Scenes shifted to Washington. President Pierce had been succeeded by our man James Buchanan, who was strongly under this Southern influence. So Buchanan supported the Lecompton Constitution. I don't know if it was this class or not, but some classes always ask, like, why is Buchanan such a bad president? One, right here, he supports the Lecompton Constitution, okay? Even though it's not legitimate. Douglas throws his support behind true popular sovereignty, basically legitimizing the idea that the Lecompton Constitution is not legitimate, okay? Compromise, submit the entire Constitution to the people. Free soilers thronged to polls and voted it down. Kansas remained a territory until 1861, when the secessionists left Congress. So what that meant was they could not become a state and join the Union until after the Civil War started. Does that make sense? So the Civil War started, all the Southern guys leave Congress, they then join the Union. Buchanan's actions divided the Democratic Party, okay? And it will split. So you'll have Northern and Southern Democrats. Now, this is yet again a interesting time period. Yes, Mr. Murray.
So Kansas, their economy was more like similar to the northern economy.
So it wasn't necessarily similar to a northern economy. It was different. So what is Kansas known for growing? Wheat,
corn.
right?
Oh, wheat. Dang.
Iowa's more the corn state, but it's more of a breadbasket type state. You don't need, like, I'm sure slaves would be useful in that, but it's not like, say, cotton that requires all of the like manual picking of the cotton. To harvest wheat, especially with the mechanical age, it didn't require slaves.
Way easier.
Right, because you don't have to process it really. So they did not necessarily have a need for slavery. That's the big thing there. So Bleeding Kansas, right, becomes this big national issue, this idea that they're fighting a civil war in Kansas over slavery. So a leading abolitionist from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner here, is going to give this speech, okay? It talks about made himself one of the most disliked men in the Senate, delivered a speech to the crime against Kansas, condemned pro-slavery, referring insultingly to South Carolina and Senator Andrew Butler. What he did was in his speech, he insinuates, or he makes a metaphor, if you will, that South Carolina is like a prostitute, right? Effectively, and that Butler is like having an affair with it, right? With slavery and this kind of notion. This goes against South Carolina's more genteel feelings, we'll say. So Congressman Preston Brooks, right, the other senator, resented the insult to the state and its senator. Brooks then, only alternative was to chastise the senator. So in 1856, in May, he will pound him with an 11-ounce cane until it broke, right? So on the floor of the Senate, he bashes Sumner, excuse me. Brooks hits Sumner with the cane several times. Basically
Why are
making
there
him,
people in the background laughing?
what, like this dude, like why is he excited about it? And why is he
Yes.
smiling? So the sentiment, McIntosh, was this, that the sentiment was the Southerners saw it as like putting the abolitionists in their place. And so famously, the supporters of Brooks actually like mailed him canes in the mail, and they would inscribe on them stuff like "hit him one time for us," that kind of thing. So House could not muster enough votes to expel Brooks. He resigned, but was triumphantly reelected. Wow. As I said before, he was super popular in South Carolina, where he was getting elected. For 3.5 years, Massachusetts kept the seat open for Sumner so he could return. Sumner had to go to like Europe and like try to seek all these treatments because they beat him pretty bad. Bleeding Sumner thus joined Bleeding Kansas as a political issue. Free Soil North infuriated by Brooks. Copies of Sumner's speech sold by thousands. Sumner-Brooke clash ensuring reactions revealed how dangerously inflamed passions have become. Blows rained on Sumner for among the first of the Civil Wars, it says. So we get through the election of 1856. The big thing here in 1856 is we have a new party. We have the Republicans. They are old Free Soilers and Whigs. And they're going to run, John C. Fremont. Anybody know who John C. Fremont is? John C. Fremont sometimes was referred to as a mountain man, or Pathfinder was his nickname. He was like an outdoorsy, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett kind of guy, but in California. And when the Mexican-American War was going, he basically was the guy that overthrew the Mexican government in California and started the Bear Flag Republic. Okay. So, but the problem is he's not a politician and he's not going to play the game very well. All right. And he will not get elected. But I'm going to see if I can do this. I don't know how it's going to work, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try to play the video on the screen here. So I need to stop sharing here, I think. And I'm going to come over here. What did I say, election of 1852? Negative. 56. All right. Mr. B. All right, so we're going to go screen share. Boom. Share.
Presidential elections in American history. The 18th presidential election in American history took place on November 4th, 1856. Franklin Pierce had a pretty rough time over the previous 4 years and now struggled to get his own party's renomination. At the Democratic Party's convention, 4 main candidates were in the running: Pierce, James Buchanan, Little Giant himself, Stephen Douglas, and the beautiful Lewis Cass. It was a tight race between 4 well-established and qualified candidates. In the end, Buchanan won the nomination. His running mate was John C. Breckinridge, a former U.S. representative from Kentucky. By this time, the Whig Party had mostly collapsed. Most former Whigs had joined either the Know Nothing Party or a brand new political party called the Republican Party. The Republican Party was formed in 1854 to oppose the extremely controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. At the first Republican National Convention in June of 1856, they met to approve an anti-slavery platform, an end to polygamy in Mormon settlements, and federal aid for a transcontinental railroad. Their nominee for president was John C. Fremont, a former senator from California, although Supreme Court Justice John McLean from Ohio was in the running. Fremont's running mate was William L. Dayton, a former senator from New Jersey. The American Party, formerly the Native American Party, and nicknamed the Know Nothing Party, by this time had gained much support for their nativist platform. Nativism is the policy of protecting the interests of native citizens against foreigners. And the American Party mostly targeted Irish Catholics, who they complained were hurting the country. Even though former President Millard Fillmore was not a member of the American Party, nor was he a nativist, and he never attended an American Party function, the party nominated him to be president anyway. He was actually out of the country at the time of the nomination and had not been consulted beforehand. Still, he just sort of went with it. The Know Nothings nominated Andrew Jackson Donaldson, the nephew of Andrew Jackson. There were 2 other political parties that ran candidates for president, the deceptively named North American Party and the North American Seceders Party, but they were pretty insignificant, so we won't go into who they endorsed. Slavery was the inescapable issue of the day, and it would be quite an understatement to say the country was divided on the issue. The Republican Party unapologetically opposed expanding slavery out west. Its slogan was, quote, "Free speech, free press, free soil, free men, Fremont, and victory," unquote. The Democrats warned that a Fremont victory would bring a civil war. The American Party attacked Fremont also, calling him a Catholic, even though it wasn't true. Oh, man. The fact is, despite their xenophobia, the American Party attracted many who were scared at how divided the country had become. Their candidate, Fillmore, at least promised a return to unity. And here are the results. James Buchanan won, becoming the 15th president of the United States, despite not receiving a majority of the vote. He received 174 electoral votes and 45.3% of the popular vote. John C. Fremont finished pretty strong for a new political party. He received 114 electoral votes and 33.1% of the popular vote. Millard Fillmore came in third, receiving 8 electoral votes, so the state of Maryland, and 21.5% of the popular vote. John C. Breckinridge became the 14th vice president in American history. The success of the Republican Party was troublesome for many Southerners. After this election, the country seemed to be just hanging on, trying desperately to stay unified. By the next presidential election, a civil war was much more of a reality than just a talking point.
Cheeks were in the bloom. Now I stand.
I'll see you for the next election, buddy.
All right, so stop that. Share this screen. Boom. Screen broadcast. Start. All right, go back to this. All right, so as we saw in the video, right, our our major guys, right, were the Republicans with Fremont, but Fremont, not a very good politician, had some kind of skeletons in his closet, and the know-nothings, right, besides the Democrats. And the Democrats win with Fillmore. And we just already saw this. The Republicans, right, had a pretty good showing for being new, as you can see up there, taking the northern states. So why Republican defeat? It says right here, Fremont's lack of honesty, capacity, and sound judgment. As I said before, he wasn't a very good politician. And this takes us to Dred Scott. Okay, so Dred Scott v. Sanford, right? I'm going to be quick through this so we can get through most of the slides and be done with it so we can get to the Civil War. But Dred Scott, right? I've already told you this story before, but the notion here, right, was that Dred Scott had been a slave of a military doctor, and he moved around the country, right? In certain places, Dred Scott would get like loaned out, okay? And so he would make money kind of on the side, and he would save it up, Dred Scott did. One of these times while he was loaned out, he met a woman, and they got married, and the military doctor actually bought his wife as well. And, you know, it wasn't, I shouldn't say it wasn't horrible, but the idea was that it wasn't, it was a situation where they could live together and save money, right, as they worked for people. Well, when the military doctor dies, they go to the widow and say, hey, we'd like to buy our freedom. And the widow refuses. And so they say that since they had been, or, you know, Dred Scott says, since he had been a slave in a free territory, basically Minnesota, the Minnesota territory at that point, that he should be considered free. So, as it says right here, case was simple. Slave lived for 5 years on free soil. Supreme Court turned it down due to a complex political issue. The rule that Scott was a black slave and not a citizen. Therefore, he had no rights to sue. Okay. The court could have thrown out the case on these technical grounds, but it goes into a deeper idea. So the majority decided to go further, and they decreed that because a slave was private property, he or she could be taken to any territory and legally held there in slavery. Reason the Fifth Amendment that says Congress can't take away the right of property without the due process of law. Yes, sir. Sure. So Congress had no power to ban slavery from territories, regardless of what territorial legislatures themselves might want. Southerners delighted with the victory. Champions of popular slavery were aghast. Okay. The notion is, right? The notion is that slavery now could expand wherever it wanted, right? Minus, say, established free states. But the notion, yet again, is that the basic concept is those inalienable rights that we talked about, the idea of the right to property. And thus, the government can't take your property away without due process or like some reason. So in this instance, right, when it comes to slavery, slavery is now kind of like much more open to expansion. Combine this with, right, yet again, Kansas, Nebraska, bleeding Kansas, you know, the beatdown in the Senate. It's really feeling like the wheels are about to fall off in the country. So Republicans defied court because most members of the court were Southern. By entering politics, court had debased itself. Southerners inflamed by defiance. How long could they be? Basically, these questions over the court, right, are also going to drive us apart. We're going to get the financial crisis of 1857. Why? Two reasons. California gold and the war, the Crimean War, right, over in on the Black Sea there, is going to lead to grain prices going up, okay? American grain was being bought by European powers to feed their armies. And so, with that overstimulated grain production, what's going to happen? What happened when the price of cotton was going up back in 1817? Eventually. Yeah, people, if the you know, the law of supply and demand, right, that you'll learn about next year in economics, the law of supply is kind of an interesting one that you're not necessarily going to be aware of. But the notion is the price of something goes up, the supply goes up, right? Because people want to supply it. That's the whole thing. So as the price of grain goes up, people want to make more grain so they can get in on the game. So speculation happens where people start to buy land and all this sort of stuff. And eventually the bubble bursts and over 5,000 businesses fail, right? North and its grain growers were the hardest. South enjoyed favorable cotton prices. So it was kind of held okay there. There's a picture of people running on the bank. Eastern industrialists feared losing workers. So panic provided further proof cotton was king, helped drive overconfident Southerners. Distress in the North, agriculture invigorated, call for homesteads of 160 acres plus public domain, or from the public domain, opposition to free farmland. Eastern industrialists feared they would lose workers. This is a big thing as we'll move forward, we'll see. But the notion is the Homesteading and eventually Homestead Act is the idea that if you went out into the wilderness to where it's like a territory that the government owned the land, depending on which act was passed, you could either buy it super cheap, or if you lived there and improved the land and you stayed for like 5 years or something, you would get it for free. So Eastern industrialists didn't like that because they thought all their like poor workers would up and move east for the homesteads. So 1860, they passed the Homestead Act, public land available for 25 cents an acre, killed by Buchanan's veto. And why did Buchanan veto it? He was big with the Southern Democrats, and the Southern Democrats didn't like it. 1857 created a call for higher tariffs, large treasury surplus, as well as pressure from the South. Congress lowered the tariff in 1857. So they reduced it by 20%, okay? Treasury surplus melted away. Industrial North pointed to need for higher duties. Concerned mostly about the need for increased protection. And who's not going to want increased protection for the North? The South, right? So in 1857, gave Republicans two surefire economic issues, right? Protection for the unprotected, as it says right there. Oh no, my pencil died. And farms for the farmless. Now, this takes us to the rise of old Abe Lincoln. Abe Lincoln is gonna, I'm gonna go through this quickly, but when's the bell ring actually? 30, so I got 20 minutes, okay. Illinois senator, right? Election of 1858, claimed the national spotlight. Douglas is the incumbent senator for the Democrats. Lincoln is going to run as a Republican, and they're going to have the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. He was a trial lawyer before he was a politician. And as it says right there, he served an undistinguished term in Congress in 47 and 49. What happened in 1847 and 49? No?
Oh, that's the.
The Mexican-American War. And so Lincoln famously was one of the guys that did not like the Mexican-American War. Kansas-Nebraska Act lit a fire within him, right? Emerged as one of the foremost Republican politicians and orators in the Northwest. Republican convention in 1856. Lincoln received 100 votes for vice presidential nomination.
He was,
There's a young Lincoln without the beard.
he was still a senator at this point. Like,
He-
instead of becoming the vice president, he maintained his position as senator.
He never won. He didn't win as senator.
Oh, yeah, he ran.
He ran for it. Yeah. That's old Lincoln, young Lincoln. Supposedly, also Lincoln supposedly had like a high-pitched voice, like it was real squeaky. You don't think about that because he was renowned as like a great orator. He was supposedly like a great public speaker, but his voice is not like, you look at him and you assume he has like a deep, like, you know, deep voice, but he doesn't. He supposedly had a squeaky voice. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates here, right? Basically, they are going to have a series of debates around Illinois. Lincoln is going to press him on the ideas of popular sovereignty and the Dred Scott question, and Douglas comes back with the idea of the Freeport question, right? And the Freeport Doctrine basically said this, that if people didn't want slavery, right? So no matter what the Supreme Court ruled, slavery would stay down if people voted it down. Laws to protect slavery would be passed by territorial legislatures. The idea being that if the will of the people was not to have slavery, then there wouldn't be slavery and people would just ignore the Supreme Court, right? That's what he's getting at. Douglas defeats Lincoln for the Senate seat, but Honest Abe emerged as a potential Republican nominee. A lot of times you see this in politics here, like a few years ago, now it seems kind of silly, but a few years ago, when Beto O'Rourke really pushed Cruz in the senatorial election, people discussed his possibility of being like an Abe Lincoln type character that would then run for president and possibly win. Obviously, that did not happen, but that was the narrative that we got from that. So there's Lincoln, right? Lincoln gets elected. We haven't got there quite yet, but he will get elected. At that same time, John Brown continues his rampage, if you will. So he studied the slave uprisings in the past, and he thought, so La Ovatora, right, was in Haiti, Nat Turner, right, with his famous slave revolt. All of these, right, lead Brown to, his goal was they were going to seize the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. In seizing that arsenal, he was then going to use the weapons to arm the slaves to have like a slave uprising in the South. The problem is when he gets there, it says right there, he kills 7 innocent people, injured 10 or so more, and nobody comes to his aid, and the government shows up, and he is like encircled. Brown and his remnants are going to be captured by U.S. Marines and Robert E. Lee and convicted for murder and treason. Famously, he is going to march to the scaffolding without any sort of, you know, what's the term I'm looking for? Like resistance, yeah, but like when you show that you're sorry. Remorse, thank you. Effects to Harper Ferry were inflammatory. Right to the south, Brown was a murderer, as it says right there. And to the north, he was a like messianic figure to some extent. So moderate Northerners and Republicans, leaders deplored Brown's actions, but the people that were extreme like him saw him as this like fanatical leader. Abolitionists and ardent Free Soilers infuriated by Brown's execution. Free Soilers in the north told bells, fired guns. and the ghost of Brown would not be laid to rest. Here's a famous picture, right, of Brown being walked to the gallows. So we now have the election of 1860, okay? You'll see that there's a lot of issues. Namely, the Democrats are going to split, okay? The Northern and Southern Democrats are going to form out of the Democrats. That is going to lead to eventually a middle of the road group here called the Constitutional Union Party. And the Constitutional Union Party is basically going to be these guys that they want to kind of hold everything together. They don't want to address slavery, okay? So you have pro-slavery Southern Democrats, you have the Constitutional Unionists, you have anti-slavery Northern Democrats, and then you're going to have the Republicans. So William Seward is going to run alongside Lincoln, but Lincoln will win. Seward will be his Secretary of State. Lincoln enthusiasts staged roaring rallies and parades. Yeah. And the Republican. Yep. So you can see here he wins with, a majority of electoral votes, but not the popular vote. And I will show us another Mr. Bates video here. Boop. Stop. Where's Zoom? There it is. Nope, that's my email. There's him.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. Who knew that a presidential election could directly lead to war? The 19th presidential election in American history took place on November 6th, 1860. Hey, that is my birthday! Well, if I was alive back then. Anyway, yeah, this presidential election was okay, it was a big freaking deal. As I said before, the United States had been growing more divided throughout the 1850s over the issue of the expansion of slavery out west and the rights of slave owners. In 1860, tensions were obviously high, not only between Democrats and Republicans, but within the Democratic Party. At the Democratic National Conventions, notice how that was plural, extreme pro-slavery, quote, fire eaters walked out in protest. No, they weren't dragons. They were nicknamed fire eaters because they refused to compromise on slavery to a point where they wanted to secede and start their own country. They ended up being known as the Southern Democratic Party, as most of them were Southerners, and nominated their own candidates. Those Democrats who remained nominated Stephen Douglas, who by this time was very well known across the country as a moderate on the slavery issue, who favored a thing called popular sovereignty. Benjamin Fitzpatrick was nominated for vice president, but he refused the nomination. So they nominated Herschel Johnson instead, the former governor of Georgia. So they were the nominees for what became known as the Northern Democratic Party. Meanwhile, the Southern Democratic Party got together again and nominated current Vice President John C. Breckinridge for president and Joseph Lane, a senator from Oregon, as his running mate. Wait, Oregon? Oregon's a state now? Heck yeah! Both Oregon and Minnesota were now states and got to participate in this election for the first time. Oh yeah, James Buchanan, the current president, remember he was a Democrat, wasn't even brought up as a nominee for re-election. That shows you just how unpopular he was. The Republican Party, now stronger than they were in 1856, had 4 top contenders for their nomination. William Seward, a senator from New York, Salmon P. Chase, a former governor and senator of Ohio, Edward Bates, a former representative from Missouri, and rising star Abraham Lincoln, a former representative from Illinois. Lincoln had become famous after a series of highly publicized debates with Stephen Douglas when the two both ran for senator of Illinois in 1858. Lincoln had lost that election, but now had a chance to face his old rival again for this time a much higher office. You might argue already know this, but Lincoln won the nomination, mostly because he was the most moderate of the four I mentioned. The Republicans chose Hannibal Hamlin, a senator from Maine, as his running mate. To further complicate this election, there were other nominees. Former Whigs who wanted to avoid the country splitting up over the slavery issue created a new political party called the Constitutional Union Party. Their slogan was, quote, "The Union as it is, and the Constitution as it is," unquote. So yeah, I guess the name fit. They nominated John Bell, a former senator from Tennessee, with Edward Everett, a really good speaker and former governor and senator of Massachusetts, as his running mate. There were other candidates, but in a crowded field already, the other candidates barely had any support, so I will not mention them here. It seemed to be another classic four-way race. While Lincoln and the Republicans promised they did not want to ban slavery completely, many Southerners weren't convinced and swore if Lincoln won, then they were gone. As in secession. As in, there are two countries now, fool. In 10 Southern states, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot. While the Northern Democrats and the Constitutional Union Party campaigned that they were the ones who could keep the country united, they ironically further caused the country to divide, as we will soon find out. Stephen Douglas made numerous personal appearances and gave speeches to campaign, which back then was rare. In fact, Douglas changed the game by doing this, and many more later would follow in his path. This election also had campaign flyers with photographs of the candidates for the first time. Imagine that, seeing what the person you voted for actually looks like. And vote they did. Voters came out to the polls in higher numbers, more so than at any point prior in American history. It's an understatement to say the stakes were high in this one. And here are the results. Although he won less than 40% of the popular vote, Abraham Lincoln won, becoming the 16th president of the United States. While this election had the second highest voter turnout in American history, it was very sectional. For example, the 3 states with the highest voter turnouts voted the most one-sided. Looking at this map, you can easily tell how if you lived in a certain part of the country, chances are you were voting for the same candidate as your region or state. The South was a little less united than the North in who they voted for, though. Abraham Lincoln, who today is considered by most to be the best American president in history, in 1860 only had support of mostly Northerners. He did receive an impressive 180 electoral votes, though, as the North had most of the population of the country. Hannibal Hamlin became the 15th vice president in American history. John C. Breckinridge finished second in the Electoral College, receiving 72 electoral votes, but third in the popular vote with 18.1%. John Bell finished third in the Electoral College, receiving 39 electoral votes, but fourth in the popular vote with 12.6%. Stephen Douglas finished fourth in the Electoral College, receiving 12 electoral votes, but was second in the popular vote with 29.5%. Douglas was the only candidate winning electoral votes in both slave and free states, winning Free State New Jersey and Slave State Missouri. How much did the South hate Lincoln? In the one southern state where he was actually on the ballot, he received just 1.1% of the popular vote. This election was a direct cause of southern states beginning to secede from the Union. Immediately following the election results, a South Carolina convention declared, quote, that the Union now subsisting between South Carolina and other states under the name of United States of America is hereby dissolved, unquote. It was the first state to leave. By the time Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, 6 more southern states would follow, forming a new country called the Confederate States of America. Lincoln, of course, was against secession and did not recognize the new country. On April 12, 1861, after a group of pro-Union forces refused to abandon their post at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, Confederate forces attacked and easily took them over. This was the beginning of the American Civil War. Just 5 weeks after being sworn in, Lincoln found himself fighting in what would become by far the deadliest war in American history. Welcome to the presidency, Mr. Lincoln.
Then I wish I was in Dixie, hooray!
I'll see you for the next election, buddy.
Hooray!
Didn't Lincoln cheat the election?
Did he cheat the election?
Yeah, I thought he paid voters.
No.
It's not a history channel.
But that was before
All right, so As we just had there, right? Lincoln wins, and that causes, and as he pointed out in the video, you can see the sectional regions and how everybody voted, right? It's interesting, right, that the middle states are the ones that voted the, constitutional keep the country together party. But out of this, right, we start to see secession. So you see the counties here and how people started to vote for secession. Yet again, in that, basically that strong, like, Georgia's a mixed bag, but Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, chunk of Texas, the Carolinas, all for secession, all right? Hot passions, as it says, not cool reasons, began to drive events. So South Carolina will be the first to secede. Just 4 days after the election, they will call a convention and secede, and that will cause all sorts of stuff. We're going to see the Crittenden amendments, sometimes referred to as the Crittenden Compromise, which basically says, you know what? Slavery's cool. We won't ban slavery south of 3630, and we won't we'll write it into the Constitution or whatever that we're not gonna tinker with it, right? And slave supporters guaranteed full rights in Southern territories regardless of popular sovereignty during territorial period. Lincoln says, no thanks, right? And it falls apart, right? It's like a last-ditch effort. 6 more states then secede: Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, AKA the SEC. And we see them form the Confederate States of America in Montgomery, Alabama, 1861, and they elect Jefferson Davis as their president. And that's old Jefferson Davis right there. Crisis is deepened by our lame duck president, James Buchanan. So Buchanan doesn't do anything. So yet again, Buchanan, right, made a bad call on bleeding Kansas and kind of handling the early Civil War stuff. And then when states secede, he does nothing, right? Instead of actively trying to fight for these states to stick together, he does nothing. And it says right during this time, secessionists gained more and more momentum. He didn't believe that Southern states could legally secede. He could find no other authority in the Constitution for stopping them, though. As we'll see after the Civil War, Lincoln will believe that there's no way to leave the Union, right? And so those states really never left. It's a thing we'll get into when we talk about Reconstruction. Tiny standing army, right? Couldn't do much to do anything about it. Weakness, not so much Buchanan's, but in the Constitution it says. Ironically, Lincoln became president. He continued Buchanan's wait-and-see policy. Secessionists left for a number of reasons, mostly related to slavery, right? But really, it's the election of the Republicans who were anti. So they were not necessarily, they were anti-slavery, but what you're going to see Lincoln run on is no expansion of slavery. He did not actually want to outlaw slavery when he was elected president, okay? That's one of those things that people don't really realize. He was just against the spread of slavery. He didn't like slavery, he detested it, but he didn't know what to do about it, and so his actual stance was leave slavery in the South and it can't expand. The North then, if you were a Southerner, I should say, what did that, you extrapolate that out in your mind, what does that then eventually lead to?
No slavery in the South.
Not necessarily no slavery in the South. What's the next step? If slavery can't expand anywhere, what are you going to lose?
Probably the balance between Congress.
Right, the balance in Congress, which means you're not going to be able to pass the votes you need for stuff, and then eventually maybe no slavery. But the first thing is that balance in Congress is going to be under attack right off the bat. The stuff like John Brown's raid, the success of the Underground Railroad, the fact that people weren't enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act is also something that they didn't like, right? And they didn't like this idea of vassalage to the North, right? Vassalage is like, say, being like a peasant, right? That kind of thing to the North. All right, we'll stop here. Guys at home, have a good one.
Thank you, Mr. Pruitt. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Pruitt.
Bye,
Have
Mr.
a great
Pruitt.
weekend. Bye-bye.